She thought the man serving champagne in first class was just another flight attendant. She smiled at him. She thanked him. She even asked him for another glass. Then she looked up again and realized she was looking directly into the eyes of her husband. For a few seconds, the entire world seemed to stop. Her husband said nothing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask who the man beside her was. He simply looked at the first-class ticket in his hand, then at the woman wearing his wedding ring. The man beside her had no idea what was happening. He didn't know that the woman who had paid for his luxurious seat was married. And he certainly didn't know that her husband was the man standing in front of them. But Michael knew something they didn't. He had already seen their names together on the passenger list. He had already noticed the seat numbers. And now he had to spend the next several hours doing the one thing he had never imagined he would have to do: serve his own wife and the man she was secretly traveling with. But there was one detail Michael hadn't discovered yet. The first-class ticket wasn't the only thing she had paid for. And when he eventually learned what else his wife had been hiding, the betrayal became far bigger than he had imagined. Michael Carter had been married to Lauren for 12 years. From the outside, theirs looked like the kind of marriage people envied. They lived in a beautiful home outside Atlanta. They traveled several times a year. They had expensive cars, good friends, and a lifestyle that most couples spent decades trying to achieve. But Michael had never been the wealthy one. He worked for what he had. For almost 20 years, he had worked in commercial aviation, eventually becoming a senior flight attendant on international routes. Lauren's story was different. She had built a technology consulting company from almost nothing. In the early years, Michael had watched her work late into the night. He had listened when she doubted herself. He had encouraged her when investors rejected her ideas. And when the company finally succeeded, Michael was one of the first people she called. The money came quickly after that. Lauren went from worrying about bills to discussing million-dollar contracts. The woman Michael had married was still there, but her world had become completely different. Private dinners replaced quiet evenings at home. Business conferences replaced weekend trips. Her calendar filled with meetings, flights, hotel reservations, and people Michael barely knew. At first, he was proud. He told friends that his wife was building something remarkable. But then the small changes began. Lauren started keeping her phone with her everywhere. She changed the password. She stopped leaving it on the kitchen counter. When Michael asked who she was talking to late at night, she always had an answer. It was a client, an investor, a colleague, someone from work. And because Michael loved her, he accepted those explanations. Maybe that's one of the hardest things about betrayal. It rarely begins with one enormous lie. It begins with dozens of small explanations that are just believable enough to make you question your own instincts. Then there was Ethan Brooks. Ethan was 36 and worked with Lauren on several of her company's major projects. He was intelligent, confident, and comfortable in the wealthy circles Lauren had entered. At first, Michael had no reason to worry about him. Lauren mentioned Ethan occasionally. She called him a business associate. Nothing more. But over time, Ethan's name started appearing more often. There were meetings with Ethan, dinners with Ethan, conferences where Ethan happened to be present. Then came the trips. Lauren would say she was leaving for 2 days. Sometimes she returned 3 days later. When Michael asked what happened, there was always an explanation. A delayed meeting, a client dinner, a last-minute event. Michael wanted to trust his wife. So he did something many people do when they sense that something is wrong. He ignored the feeling because accepting it would hurt too much. Meanwhile, Lauren and Ethan were becoming closer. Their professional relationship had crossed a line. What had once been conversations about business became personal. They began meeting privately. They started taking trips together without telling Michael. And Lauren began spending money on Ethan. Not small amounts. Hotel suites, expensive dinners, designer gifts, and eventually, a first-class ticket. The trip that changed everything began on a Thursday morning. Lauren told Michael she had an important business trip. She said she would be gone for several days. Michael didn't ask too many questions. He had a long international flight of his own scheduled that afternoon. Their paths, as far as he knew, were going in completely different directions. But there was one thing neither of them knew. Michael's airline had changed his assignment. Instead of working the route he expected, he was assigned to an international flight leaving Atlanta that afternoon. When he arrived at the airport and checked the passenger information, he saw a familiar name. Lauren Carter. He stared at it. Then he looked at the seat number. First class. His stomach tightened. Maybe it was another Lauren Carter. Maybe there was some innocent explanation. Then he saw the second passenger, Ethan Brooks, the same Ethan Lauren had always described as a colleague. Michael didn't call Lauren. He didn't text her. He didn't confront her. He simply stood there for a moment, staring at the passenger manifest. Then he put his phone away, adjusted his uniform, and went to work. When boarding began, Michael watched passengers enter the aircraft. He saw families, couples, businessmen, tourists, and people traveling alone. Then Lauren walked through the door. She was dressed elegantly, pulling a small designer suitcase behind her. She didn't see Michael. She was looking at her phone. Seconds later, Ethan walked in behind her. He smiled at her. She smiled back. They looked like two people who believed they were completely safe. Michael watched them disappear toward first class. He didn't follow immediately. He stood there, breathing slowly, trying to understand how the woman he had married 12 years earlier had ended up on the same aircraft with the man he had spent months trying not to suspect. Then he walked into the first-class cabin. And that's where the moment happened. Lauren was already seated beside Ethan. They were talking quietly. Ethan was laughing. Lauren was smiling. Michael approached their row carrying drinks. Lauren looked up and thanked him without recognizing him. Then she looked again. Her expression changed instantly. Michael said nothing. He simply looked at her. For a few seconds, the cabin seemed strangely quiet. Then Lauren whispered, "Michael." He answered calmly, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter." Ethan looked at Lauren. "You know him?" Lauren couldn't answer. Michael placed the drinks on the table. Then he asked the two of them if they needed anything else. Lauren shook her head. Michael walked away. That was the moment the marriage began to end. Not because he had discovered that she was sitting beside another man. He had suspected that for months. What destroyed him was seeing the evidence with his own eyes. The woman he had trusted had deliberately brought another man into a first-class cabin and believed she could keep it hidden. And now he was expected to serve them. For the next several hours, Michael performed his job exactly as he had been trained to do. He smiled at passengers. He served meals. He poured drinks. He checked seat belts. He answered questions. But every time he approached Lauren's row, he could feel her watching him. She barely spoke to Ethan anymore. She knew the secret was gone. About an hour into the flight, Michael walked past their seats and heard Ethan quietly ask, "Lauren, are you sure he's your husband?" Lauren whispered something he couldn't hear. Ethan looked toward the aisle. Michael kept walking. He didn't need to hear the answer. He already knew. But there was something else he hadn't discovered. Lauren hadn't simply bought Ethan a first-class ticket. She had also booked a private luxury hotel suite at their destination. The reservation was under Ethan's name. The room had been paid for using a company account. And Michael would eventually find that information too. That was when the betrayal became larger than an affair. It wasn't just about another man. It was about deception, money, and the life they had built together. If you're following this story, I want to ask you something. Imagine discovering that your spouse had secretly arranged a luxury trip with someone else, and then realizing you were the person assigned to serve them during the flight. Would you confront them immediately, or would you stay silent until the plane landed? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about relationships, betrayal, money, and the decisions that change people's lives, subscribe to the channel, because what happened after this flight was even more revealing than what happened during it. When the aircraft finally landed, Lauren didn't immediately leave. She waited until the first-class cabin was nearly empty. Ethan had already gone through the terminal. Michael remained inside the aircraft completing his duties. Lauren stood near the exit. She looked exhausted. Michael approached her. For the first time since the flight began, there were no passengers watching them. No crew members standing nearby. No strangers listening. Just a husband and wife who had 12 years of history between them. Lauren said, "Michael, please let me explain." He looked at her and asked one question. "How long?" She lowered her head. "How long have you been seeing him?" Lauren didn't answer immediately. Finally, she admitted that it had been going on for months. Michael asked whether the business trips had been real. Some were. Others weren't. He asked about the hotel reservations. She admitted that several had been for Ethan. He asked about the money. She admitted that she had paid for some of Ethan's expenses. Michael stood there quietly. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't threatening anyone. He simply looked at the woman he had spent 12 years loving and realized he didn't recognize the person standing in front of him. Lauren tried to explain that she felt lonely. She said Michael was always working. She said her life had changed and she felt that he didn't understand the person she had become. She said Ethan understood her world. Michael listened. Then he asked her something simple. When did you stop trusting me enough to tell me the truth? Lauren had no answer. Michael reminded her of the years when they had struggled together. Before the money, before the company, before the luxury hotels and first-class seats. He had been there when she had almost given up. He had believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. And now, after everything, she had chosen to hide her life from him rather than tell him what had changed. Lauren begged him not to make a decision that night. She promised she could end things with Ethan. She promised they could rebuild their marriage. Michael didn't respond immediately. Then he said, "You already made your decision. I'm just finally learning what it was." He walked away. In the weeks that followed, Lauren tried to repair the damage. She sent messages. She called. She apologized. She offered explanations. She even suggested marriage counseling. Michael agreed to one conversation. But during that conversation, he realized something important. He wasn't trying to decide whether he could forgive the affair. He was trying to decide whether he could ever trust her again. And those were two different questions. Forgiveness, he eventually learned, was something he could choose for himself. Trust was something Lauren would have to rebuild. And Michael wasn't sure he wanted to spend years rebuilding something she had deliberately destroyed. Their marriage eventually ended. The details were handled privately. There were lawyers, financial discussions, property decisions, and difficult conversations. But the most painful part wasn't dividing their possessions. It was accepting that 12 years of memories could coexist with a betrayal that made those memories feel different. Ethan eventually disappeared from Lauren's life. What had seemed exciting when it was secret became far less attractive once the consequences became real. Lauren still had her money. Her company continued. She could still travel first class. She could still stay in the most expensive hotels. But there was one thing her wealth could not restore: the trust of the man who had loved her before she became wealthy. Michael continued working. Months later, he was assigned to another international route. As he walked through first class, he noticed a couple laughing together. The husband reached across the seat and held his wife's hand. Michael looked away. He wasn't jealous. He wasn't angry. He simply remembered. He remembered that flight. The passenger manifest. The first-class cabin. The champagne. His wife's face when she recognized him. And the question he had asked himself afterward. How could someone have everything and still risk losing the person who stood beside them when they had nothing? Perhaps that is the real lesson in what happened. Money can make life more comfortable. It can buy better seats, bigger houses, expensive dinners, and unforgettable vacations. But money cannot make someone loyal. It cannot make someone honest. And it cannot buy back trust after it has been broken. Lauren thought the most expensive part of that trip would be the first-class ticket. She was wrong. The ticket cost thousands of dollars. The marriage cost 12 years. And the price of the secret was something neither of them could ever recover. Michael once told Lauren, "I didn't lose you on that airplane. I lost you long before that. I just didn't know it." And perhaps that's the sentence that explains everything. Betrayal rarely begins when the truth is discovered. It begins much earlier, when someone decides that the person they promised to love no longer deserves the truth. So now I want to ask you one final question. If you were Michael, would you have forgiven Lauren after 12 years of marriage? Would the history you shared be enough to give her another chance? Or would the moment you saw her sitting beside another man in first class have been the moment you walked away for good? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. And if this story reminded you that loyalty is worth more than money, subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about love, betrayal, trust, and the choices that can change a person's life forever.